Hello, dear viewer and my dear student and learner. Welcome to your favorite program, The Knowledge Quest. I'm your teacher, Alex Obara, and I'll be taking you through history and government. And we're still on discussions on the contacts between East Africa and the outside world up to 19th century. And so far, we've covered a number of contacts. We are on the final contacts on the spread of Christianity in the 19th century. And I can remember in our last discussion we gave detailed information about Christian spread in East Africa and how it began, how the initial attempts by the Portuguese were not successful, but eventually in the 18th and 19th century we see other European nations coming into East Africa, and among the agenda that they had was to spread Christianity. And therefore, they begin by forming a number of movements, which we discussed in our last discussion. We saw them, and they begin spreading Christianity. They begin in Kenya, we saw, in Uganda, we saw, and how it was done in Tanganyika. And then we discussed further on the factors which aided the spread of Christianity in various parts of East Africa. And after looking at those factors which aided the spread of Christianity, we discussed them into detail, my dear student, if you can remember. And I said in our next discussion, which is today, I'll be able to take you through the challenges encountered by missionaries. And in this case, I'll be able to take you into detail by discussing each point and giving a relevant explanation of each of these points. And therefore, I welcome you to the lesson today as we delve into details. Now, we say that the missionaries who came from various countries like France, some came from Britain, some came from Portugal, some came from USA. All of them experienced a number of challenges which were common to all of them. And therefore, I'm going to take you through the first one, which is the language barrier. All right? And the truth is, as they were coming into, as they came to the East Africa, they realized that their local communities had their own means of communication, their own languages, which they were not well conversant with. That means there was a barrier between them. It wasn't easy for them to communicate what they intended to. That meant that for this challenge to be solved, either of the two, that's the Africans or the Europeans, would have to learn one's language. And therefore, that became a challenge, and these led to communication difficulties and barriers. Of course, we learned that this challenge after some time was solved because the Europeans had to endeavor in learning African languages like Kiswahili, like Kikamba, Kikuyu, and all that. But that was a major challenge which faced all the communities. It wasn't easy to communicate to each other. And therefore, without communicating, it is not possible to pass whatever information, as much as it may be important. It won't be possible for you to pass it to the intended audience. So that is also the first, that is the first barrier, challenge which they faced. Challenge number two, there was the issue of tropical diseases such as malaria. And we say that East Africa lies along the tropics. Lying along the tropics means that there are some diseases which will be only found within the tropics because of the kind of probably vectors found in such an area. And therefore we said because of that we had a lot of mosquitoes which beat the missionaries, and in essence those mosquitoes infected them with diseases such as malaria. And therefore it was not very able for the missionaries to carry out the activities in an easy way with unhealthy bodies. And you realize that it went further serious to a point of killing some of the missionaries who came with an agenda of spreading Christianity. And therefore this also became a major challenge in as far as spreading Christianity is concerned. Okay, so many lost their lives, and of course we realize that this problem was solved later after the discovery of quinine as a cure for malaria. But before that, it was a main challenge, it was a serious challenge to the agenda of spreading Christianity in East Africa. And then number 3, we have the issue of hostile communities. Hostile communities. In this case, we are referring to the communities which did not welcome. Okay, they did not welcome the British. In other words, they saw the British at some point as bad omen, because you realize the skin color of the British and that of the Africans were totally different, and therefore the Africans associated the white skin with bad omen, and that meant that they were to chase them out of the land. Further still, you realize that there are some of the teachings which we are going to explore in a bit, which the Christians taught, which were not in tandem with the African traditional religion. And therefore, as a result, it was an outright, attack of their way of life. And therefore, the communities became hostile and chased them out of their homes, out of their communities, and out of their areas of residence. Therefore, that also is one of the challenges which the Christian missionaries experienced in their agenda of spreading Christianity. Number 4, you see there was also a challenge of poor transport network. The truth is that at the coming of the missionaries, Africa and East Africa, to be precise, was still backward in terms of transport and communication. Therefore, it meant that we never had the current probably motor vehicles which could be used to maneuver and move from one point to another. Therefore, it meant that they had to walk for long distances using or to walk on foot. And of course, you see, this was tiring. Walking for over 200 kilometers in a day is not an easy task. So that also became a challenge for the missionaries to cover a vast region. Therefore, it meant they could cover very small regions over a long period of time. It was not easy for them to cover up to the interior with the absence of proper means of transportation, which of course with time came in and was solved due to the construction of roads and railways, but that one we shall look into it later. So that also became a big hindrance or challenge to their quest of spreading Christianity. Then number 5, there is also the issue of hostility from slave traders and traders whose economic activities were threatened by missionaries who wanted to eradicate slave trade. What we mean here, the missionaries, Christian missionaries, came with one of the agenda of stopping slave trade, okay? Stopping slave trade and replacing it with legitimate trade. But you see, as they came, we still had some traders who had entrenched or who had gained so much out of slave trade. So in their hard work of trying to do away with legitimate, there was resistance from those raiders who had economically gained from this business of slavery. And therefore, it became also a challenge because they wanted to eradicate slave trade completely. And therefore, that also becomes another challenge which the Christian missionaries largely experienced in their work or in their quest to spread Christianity in Africa. And of course, you realize that most of the people who were involved in this exercise were mostly the Arab traders and the Swahili traders who were largely gaining out of this trade. Therefore, it was like cutting short their source of income. And that, of course, would not augur very well with them. Therefore, they resisted and they became hostile to the Christian missionaries. Then there is also another challenge which the Christian missionaries experienced, shortage of personnel. That is to mean they never had enough people to cover the vast regions of East Africa. East Africa is quite a large area, having 2 or 3 or 10 or even 20 cannot be able to suffice or cannot be able to cover the whole region. Okay, so in other words, shortage of personnel became a serious challenge because they needed backup. They needed to be sent more missionaries, and not everybody was willing to venture into such an exercise. And therefore, it became a challenge. And that means, by implication, it means that they were not able to cover more regions as they could have done with enough personnel. So that means that it was also another challenge. However, this also, like we said, could be solved if they did more converts and trained them to become missionaries in their stead. So that is another challenge, ladies and gentlemen, that the Christian missionaries experienced in their quest of spreading Christianity. And then there is also another challenge of inadequate funds. This being a venture, it needed, of course, funds. It needed funds to facilitate the work of the missionaries, to facilitate some of the activities which required construction of schools, construction of churches, construction of missionary centers, employing catechists, paying the missionaries. It was not an easy. Therefore, because of that, you realize that of some of the projects which probably were begun by the missionaries stalled or could not be able to continue as a result of not having enough funds to, fund these programs and projects. Further still, they could not be able to move into the interior, be able, sometimes it even costed them to use some of the gifts, to appeal to some of the local people, and therefore it meant they needed a lot of money, which at that time was not available. And therefore that, of course, we say became a challenge to the missionaries in their quest to spread Christianity. And then there was also another issue of cultural conflict. Cultural conflict, this made it difficult to convert Africans to Christianity. This is to imply that some of the teachings which the Christians advocated for, some of the principles which they taught, were in direct contrary to the teachings and beliefs of Africans. Some of those beliefs and teachings which were contrary to the beliefs of Africans included polygamy. In other words, you mean that Africans believed in marrying many wives. It was a sign of wellness. It was a sign of being a wealthy person. So therefore, if the Christians came with this teaching that drop polygamy and marry one woman as your wife, then that, of course, was against the beliefs of Africans. Therefore, they resisted as a result of that. There was also another aspect of ancestral worship. That is to mean the Africans worshipped their ancestors. They worshipped their ancestors, and the bringing in of the idea that they don't worship ancestral spirits and they don't worship their ancestors was in direct conflict with the beliefs of Africans. And that also, we mean to say, that challenged the Christian missionaries in teaching the Africans that it's not right to worship to worship ancestors and begin worshiping only God. That became a challenge, and therefore Africans resisted. Then there was also the issue of payment of dowry, which also became a thorny issue among the whites, the Europeans and the Africans. The way Africans used to do it was a bit different from the way that the Christian missionaries taught it. And as a result, it was also a conflict or a bone of contention, which eventually led to become a serious challenge in their quest of spreading Christianity. And then there is also another challenge that sometimes their guides and porters deserted them. That is, they could be able probably to lead them to a given area, and if there was maybe a disagreement, or if probably the porters and the guides became tired, they deserted them, or they had a disagreement, they deserted them. And that means that these are Christian missionaries lost their way. They could not be able to trace their way back, and as a result, it became a serious hindrance for them to proceed with their quest of spreading Christianity to the interior of East Africa. And then at number 10, of course, we had also the problem of opposition from the Muslims. That is to imply that Muslims had entrenched their religion so deeply in the coast of Africa and in some places in the interior of Africa. And therefore it meant that if the Europeans were in quest of spreading Christianity, they were conflicting with the work that was done by the Muslims or the Arabs in that case. And therefore there was opposition. They opposed the work of the Christians in spreading Christianity. And that of course became a serious hindrance to the mission of spreading Christianity in East Africa. Of course, you can remember in places like Uganda, as we discussed initially, we had communities that were African traditional religion. We had Protestants, we had Muslims, and we had Catholics. All these also tried to show off by of course, trying to fight each other. And therefore, that opposition became a hindrance or a stumbling block towards spreading Christianity in Africa. There's also another challenge, that was lack of basic provisions. The basic provisions, for example, water, food, and medicine. Of course, these are basic things which we need for day-to-day survival. It is not possible for people to survive without clean and fresh water, not possible for them to survive long enough without food, or sometimes if they fall sick, it's not possible for them to be able to beat the disease if sometimes they don't get a boost of the immunity through medicine. And therefore, some of these missionaries lack these basic commodities or basic things for their survival. And therefore, as a result, they were faced with diseases which weakened them because of the weakened immune system. And at the end of it all, you realize that they lost their life. Some became weak, and that, of course, worked to the detriment of spreading Christianity, or it worked negatively towards spreading Christianity in East Africa. Number 12, which is very important for us to know, there was a threat or menace of wild animals. They were attacked by fierce lions, while others suffered from snake bites. You've heard of the man-eaters of Savo. We'll be discussing this when we're talking about construction of the railway from Kenya to Uganda, and I will tell you more details about the man-eaters of Savo. This basically refers to the lions. Okay, so some of the Christians, as they were carrying out their Christian missionary activities, they were threatened by some of the dangerous wild animals, because you realize that indeed by that time Africa, and East Africa precisely, had not opened up much. It was much of covered by shrubs and woods and forest, and therefore most of the wild animals were living in those very areas. So passing through those areas could become a serious challenge, and therefore most of them were attacked, and some of them suffered from serious snake bites. Of course, along the way, there were snakes, of course, very poisonous snakes, which bit, and sometimes they could die out of the poison. They could be injured, or they could even be maimed and make them unable to move. And as a result, that also became a challenge in as far as spreading of Christianity and the missionaries is concerned. And then there was also another challenge of serious rivalry groups. There was a lot of differences and enmity between different Christian missionaries. That is, each group, like we said initially, was trying to pull towards their side. We had the Protestants trying to pull towards the Protestantism, and we had the Catholics trying to pull to Catholicism. We had the traditional African religion trying to pull their side, the Muslims also pulling their side. And therefore that slowed the pace of evangelization. And therefore it meant that because of this rivalry, these teams tried to outdo each other, to compete, and that of course has never worked very well when it comes to spreading of Christianity. And therefore that we note that was a serious challenge in as far as spreading of Christianity is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, you realize that those are some of the challenges which the Christians experienced, or Christian missionaries experienced in their quest to spread Christianity in East Africa. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we are going to look at the effects, the results, or the outcomes of Christianity. Of course, remember we say the results are both positive and negative. So we'll explore both and see what are some of the outcomes or consequences and results of evangelization of Christians, spread of Christianity in East Africa. Let's take a short break. I will be back shortly to proceed. See you shortly. Welcome back again as we proceed after the break. As I promised, we are going to continue with the effects of Christian missionary activities. And like we always say, these activities are usually, or the consequences are usually classified into two. That is both positive and negative. So I'll be able to take you through the positive, and then eventually I'll take you through the negative, even as we look forward to summarizing this topic that we have been learning in all these past lessons. So the first positive impact or effect of missionary activities is there was the spread of Christianity to many local people who are converted to Christianity, all right? So in other words, many people embraced religion, that is Christian religion, and were able to be converted to become Christians. And therefore, as a result, there are so many things which they were able to learn that which made them to become better as opposed to when they were without the religion of Christianity. Okay? Then there was number two, the introduction of Western education. Like we say, the missionaries came with a various agenda, and one of those agenda which they came with was, to educate people or to civilize them, was to give them Western education, all right? And therefore, you realize that a number of people were able to gain Western education, which assisted them to get what we call the white-collar jobs. They were able to specialize in a number of ways, okay, to get, of course, promotions and all that, to be able to work competently in various fields which required the Western education, okay? So that also is another very important aspect. Number three, there is growth of nationalism. As we shall be discussing later, you realize that there is something we call that the cross, the flag followed the cross. I'll tell you in detail that after establishing Christianity, there was the aspect of colonization. All right. So in this case here, you realize that with the coming of missionary activities, there was growth of nationalism. People tended to grow to love their countries more. And with the entrenchment of colonialization, as we shall see, there was growth of nationalism, the love for one's country. So most people in East Africa began to love their countries in earnest. And therefore, you realize at some point, they came out to fight for their freedom, as we shall discuss in a later stage. And then there's also another very important positive effect of spreading Christianity. You realize we said that as Christians were coming, they looked for ways to attract. They looked for ways to appeal to the local people. And among the ways they used was construction of schools. There was construction of hospitals and dispensaries. So in this case here, there was provision of medical services by building hospitals. And you realize that indeed there are a number of hospitals which are mission hospitals to this reason or to this moment, which are still operating as mission churches, mission hospitals. Therefore, there is also the aspect of training medical personnel like clinical officers and nurses. That means Africans who are employed, in other words, who are enrolled into the training to become nurses, to become medical doctors, to become, medical personnel in various ways. And that, of course, was important because it boosted the ability of Kenyans to fight disease, all right? And as a result of that, it was positive in that aspect. Number 5, there was the aspect of introduction of new farming methods and new crops such as coffee growing. That is to imply that, of course, as they came also, they had to find ways of making living. Okay? So they settled down, and one of the activities which they did economically was farming. And as a result, they came with some of the methods of farming which were used back in their country. Remember, these countries had undergone what you call agrarian revolution. They had learnt about some of the new techniques of farming which improved the products. And therefore, when they are coming, they introduced the new farming methods, and some of the crops which they came with, for example, coffee, which as we talk is one of the export earners in our country, which earns our country some good money. Therefore, it was also in that angle a positive result or effect to that effect also. Number 6, the coming of Christians also led to what we refer to as Bible translation into vernacular languages. Remember, we said there was that aspect of language barrier. But as the missionaries came, they were so determined, they had to learn local languages. After learning the local dialects and languages, they translated the Bible into local dialect. And that meant that it was easier for the local people to be able to understand what the Bible meant or what was written in the Word without necessarily having misinterpreted. At some point it could happen. So therefore, Bible translation into vernacular languages was of value to the local people, and that is why you realize that most of the local people now can be able to read the Bible for themselves. They can be able to understand and sometimes even interpret what is in the Bible without necessarily depending on the missionaries. All right. Then there's also another positive effect. There was the aspect of exploration. Okay. The pioneer missionaries such as Kraft and Redman and that explored East Africa. That is to say, after exploring, they painted a good image. You know, they not discover, but they saw some of the beautiful sceneries about Africa. And therefore, like we saw the likes of Redman and Kraft and Edhart, they drew maps of East Africa, crude maps of East Africa, of the interior, and they sent back. Their explorations increased the curiosity of some of the people in Europe who had to come back to Africa or who had to come to Africa to find out for themselves that is it true that the way Africa is being depicted as beautiful, that is how beautiful it is. And indeed, as they came, they were able to indeed verify and accept that East Africa is a beautiful place to be in. Therefore, there was that aspect of exploration, and this, as we shall see it in another level, it led to what we call increase of tourist attraction centers. Of course, Europeans came as tourists. Later, as it's developing, they came as tourists, and that, of course, earns Kenya some revenue, as we shall be discussing in some later stage. And then there's also their reports encouraged other explorers and traders. Of course, there are traders, of course, who were encouraged, and as a result, they came in their numbers to see if that ivory being talked about is indeed available, if that gold being spoken about is indeed available. Okay, so they came and actually they proved for themselves that Africa was richly endowed with a number of precious metals and minerals. Number 9, there was the abolition of slave trade. And remember, we said that is also one of the agenda that they came with, that they condemned slave trade and founded settlement for freed slaves. He gave examples of Freetown and Bagamoyo as areas in which, they established free settlement for freed slaves. Okay, and therefore that meant that the evil of slavery, of slave trade, had to come to eventual end. Okay, as opposed to initially where it was flourishing and Africans were used as commodities, transported to Europe and used as laborers in large plantations and suffering and misery back in Africa. So it led to abolition of slave trade. Like we said, in the year 1907, slave trade was done away with after the signing of the various treaties which we discussed about, the Mosby Treaty and the Hamilton Treaty, which brought about the end of slave trade. Having looked at that, number 10, there was development of technical skills. That is, missionaries trained Africans in a number of industrial or vocational skills. Just to mention but a few, there was the smithing, typing, masonry, tailoring, printing, and carpentry. So those skills actually were introduced by the missionaries, and you realize that they are very important skills which even to date we encourage most of our learners instead to have these skills and techniques: smithing, typing, masonry, tailoring, printing, and carpentry. So that meant that Africans were left at a better position to depend on themselves even as they explore their skills in as far as this aspect is concerned. So that's also another very important aspect, ladies and gentlemen, that Christian missionaries played in their quest to spread Christianity. And then number 11, there was the aspect of development of independent churches and schools set up by Africans. I will teach you this when we come to Form 3, when we shall be discussing about this in detail. But for now, I want to tell you that there are some Africans who took it upon themselves to begin independent. In other words, they began their own churches, which were led by Africans, which was started by Africans, and they believed that Africans also had the power, okay, to begin their churches and lead the services without necessarily involving the white missionaries. So that also became an aspect, important development of independency without necessarily depending on the white or on the European missionaries. Another very important aspect which came as a result of these Christian missionary activities, there was political representation of Africans. They represented African interest in the Legislative Council. Of course, we will discuss this, of course, again in Form 3, and we will see that missionaries also advocated during the colonial period. They advocated for African representation in the Legico or Parliament, also known as Legislative Council. And therefore, we can find later that a missionary by the name Arthur represented, okay? He was able to represent Africans, and that means some of the interests of Africans were addressed in the Legico, as opposed to initially when there was no African in the Legico, it was a white and Asian agenda. But initially Africans were represented and their issues were taken into consideration and therefore addressed into completion. Okay, so having looked at the positive, I want now to, as we sum up our discussion on this topic, we look at the negative effect of Christianity, or Christian spreading Christianity in that case. Number 1, representation of Africans in the Legico by a missionary had certain drawbacks. Why? Because it denied Africans the opportunity to participate directly in their political affairs. I said the missionaries advocated for African representation in the Legico, and what they did, they appointed a missionary by the name Arthur to represent Africans. And that means Africans did not directly address their issues in the Legico. And that means, like we said here, it denied Africans the opportunity to participate directly, okay? And that means they could not be able to address issues. And even if this person or this representative could address their issues, he did not understand them as perfect as Africans could have understood their own problems and issues that needed to be addressed. And then there was also, number 2, introduction of Western medicine. And in this case, you realize those Western medicine have adverse effects to the health. As much as we have the positive effects, there is also the adverse effect of chemicals, all right? And those chemicals are detrimental to the health of individuals. Africans had their own medicine, which were organic, all right, which were not chemically made. But now with the introduction of the Western medicine, which was in essence chemicals, led to a decline in the use of traditional medicine, all right? And thereby, that by extent, undermined the role of traditional indigenous medical specialists. Of course, you cannot say that Africans never had their medical specialists. In our discussion, initially, when we were looking at the socio-economic and political organization of African communities and Kenyan in specific, we saw there were those people who were endowed with gifts as medicine men. So with the coming of the Western medicine, those medicine men were looked down upon. In other words, they were sidelined, and that led to the decline and, of course, introduction of harmful medicine, which has eventual adverse effects on the body of the user of those medicine. Then number 5, spread of Christianity undermined beliefs and social practices of traditional religions. Like we said, there were some practices which were entrenched in the African religion. Okay, so that meant that those practices were undermined. In other words, we say that they looked at those practices as backward, and therefore that also happened to be a negative in some way, because there are some beliefs actually which were not bad per se, all right? So that also became a negative influence on that case. Then there's also number 6, erosion of cultures, and people of East Africa aped Western culture, all right? So in some way, there was that aspect of brainwash. There was the aspect of brainwash, and therefore people tended to believe that their culture is backward as opposed to that of the European nations. And therefore they strongly embraced the European culture, including the negative aspects of their culture. And therefore, it meant that the African culture, which was so rich, was eroded, and thereby promoting the Western culture and eroding the African culture. And that was a negative effect. There is also number 7, that mission education brought division among the people. That is why that's to mean to say there were those Africans who were pro-education, and there were those who were anti-education. There were those who were against formal education, and there are those who are against or who are for formal education. All right? So that brought division. You realize that the main education for Africa was usually training people on how to live. But now this one here is coming to train them on how to work and to earn money and all that. So there was division among the people, and eventually that led to an eventual, sadness and break of understanding among the people. Number 8, even as we wind up our discussion on this topic, it is soon coming to an end. Missionaries were forerunners of imperialism. That is what I began by telling you, that there is a special or a specific statement which says that the flag followed the cross. In other words, we have Christianity which came first, representing the cross. Then there was the issue of imperialism represented by the flag, all right? So missionaries in some way opened up. They were forerunners of imperialism. Imperialism in this case, we are referring to, colonialism, okay? And that, of course, also happened to be a negative. And that thereby means they pacified Africans, and they were able, to use them in a wrong way. Africans were colonized, okay? And after being colonized, in this case, you realize most of the things which Africans were endowed with, the minerals, all right? The soil which was very fertile. They came, and we had many white settlers who came and settled in those fertile lands, and Africans were pushed to reserves which were unfertile and most of the time infested by flies and other harmful insects and animals. And therefore, Africans at the end of the day did not gain. So you see again, as far as Christianity was good, there are some aspects which were brought into into play which were not very positive in that up to that end. And then number 10, they asked for protection from their home government when they encountered hostility, and that paved the way for the scramble and partition of East Africa. Remember, there are some times that Africans resisted, Okay, they resisted the coming of these missionaries in their places. And in essence, what the missionaries did was to call for assistance from their homes. And when the assistance came from their homes, the intent was to protect, but eventually there was the aspect of scramble and petition. And scramble, like we said initially, let me remind you, scramble basically means to fight for, and petition was to divide. So they came, and eventually we had what you call the Berlin Conference, which I will discuss with you in Form 3 when we'll be there, that they sat down in Berlin and they divided Africa as a cake. Therefore, various European powers that were present divided Africa amongst themselves, and that is why you realize in some place like East Africa we had Germany somewhere, the British somewhere, trying to divide Africa. So the forerunners, or rather the ones who set the pace for the coming of the imperialists or the colonialists, were the Christian missionaries. So up to that end, we have seen the effects of Christian missionary, both positive and negative, and that means we have come to the end of this topic of the contacts between East African coast and the outside world. So in our next discussion, we shall be able now to look at some of the key areas which you may be at some point be tested, and how you are supposed to answer some of the questions that are addressed in those given areas. So therefore, that means for today, we have come to the end of our discussion, and therefore that means that we'll be able to meet in our next lesson, so I can be able to take you through some of the important and key areas that you need to focus as far as your revision on that topic is concerned. Thank you for your time. Have a blessed time, and see you next time.